Oh, thank you for coming this morning. Because I have to admit, the title that I gave this sermon is really kind of off-putting to most of us. And I was a little put out when the person who sent me the link and said, "Oh, you really ought to check this out," that prompted this sermon. He's not here this morning. John, I hope you watched the video. So thank you for the courage to come and consider our faults. Well, just consider. At seminary, our theology professor very gently pounded the table to emphasize his words. He said, "Always reject dualism." Some of you get the irony on that. I want that in a cross stitch on a pillow. Always reject dualism. I share that story with you because this morning I'm going to be tossing around some dualistic terms and labels, and it makes me uncomfortable, but I promise I'm going to be very careful, okay? I'm going to be using labels that represent huge groups, and I'm just going to skip right over the muddy middle. Because that's very sloppy. I don't like to do that, but it's as far as the research has gotten us, as the extremes. So if you're in the middle and you feel left out, I apologize in advance. Okay? Here are the labels at hand: liberal and conservative. And for the most part, I'm not going to be talking about labels, liberal and conservative, in terms of our current political fracas. Because from my perspective, A, that there's plenty of other people talking about it, and B, the politics is not even about liberal and conservative anymore. It's its own beast. So when I'm talking about liberal and conservative, I'm not talking about specific political policies or parties. I'm going to be talking about brains. Brains. And evolution. And the evolution of brains, and the evolution of morality with brains, and the evolution of brains that tend to skew liberal or conservative. Okay. Now, for most of my life, probably for most of your life, we presumed that being liberal or conservative was a personal choice. Socially liberal, socially conservative. There was a choice which was shaped by or developed as a result of your family, your experiences, your education. We had this idea that brains were all just brains basically functioning alike, but that our thoughts and our thoughts of morality could be changeable, educable. And that's what made us think that if only that person with whom we disagreed, if they would just read this article, if they would just listen to this one argument, if they would just see things as I see them, that person would simply capitulate entirely over to my mindset. Which was, of course, the better and more correct way of understanding the whole world. Have you ever been through that thought process? And isn't it annoying when that other person just willfully refuses to turn their mindset over to match your own? I mean, really. At this point, at some point, you might even think that maybe a 2x4 might help make your point upside the head. But what if a liberal or conservative, being liberal or conservative, was really just not a matter of your upbringing or your experiences or your education? What if it was a matter of your brain structure? And it was your brain structure that was shaping your mindset. Okay? What if? People are fascinated by our brains. We are. And there's several new areas of social psychology that want to look at our behaviors and value systems in terms of neurology and evolution, instead of just, plain cussedness. Social psychology researcher Jonathan Haidt and others have developed a theory of moral evolution. They call it moral foundations theory. They theorize that humans have brain receptors for morality, just like we have taste receptors and light receptors, and that there are 5 foundational values from which all people weave their moral fabric. They created a website, they made it open to everybody across the globe, and people from across the globe went onto their website and filled out their survey, and they found from all these people, the social psychologists have identified that all humans value 2 foundational values: compassion and fairness. Those sound nice, don't they? Yeah, compassion. Everybody values compassion and fairness. Across cultural variations, all humans value compassion and fairness. However, some humans also respond to 3 other foundational values: group loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity or purity versus degradation. To hear those last 3 again: loyalty, authority, and sanctity. I suspect that some of us are not fully on board with those last 3 values of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Some of us are like, and that says something about us. Professor Haidt and his colleagues looked at the type of people who self-identified, this is by their own identification, as either liberal or conservative. And they found that while all people shared the values of compassion and fairness, the people who self-identified as conservative also gave high marks for all 5, including those last 3 of loyalty, group loyalty, authority, and sanctity. But the people who identified as liberal rejected those last 3. And they even considered those 3 things to be problematic values, because they saw that those could be the basis of some really icky stuff that leads to, like, fascism and fundamentalism, nationalism, exclusion. Ew. All right. To get more information, Haidt and his associates ran an experiment where they asked self-identified liberals and conservatives to fill out these surveys while pretending to be the other. Okay? It was interesting. Their analysis showed that conservatives were pretty good at mimicking how they believed liberals would respond to moral value questions. But the liberals were completely unable to get into the conservative mindset, even just long enough to answer a survey. Now, Haidt, his theory, his interpretation of this, he thinks that it might be because liberals dominate in academia and media and entertainment. So conservatives are very familiar with the liberal moral matrices. But liberals are less adept, less able to think, have less opportunity to learn to think with a conservative moral matrix. And Professor Haidt is a bit concerned by this asymmetry because he suspects that if you think about all this in terms of evolution, there might be something important in the brains of conservatives, something that allowed us all to survive and thrive long enough to make it this far. As he puts it, he is coming to see that liberals and conservatives each have a piece of the puzzle. Each are really perceptive about certain moral values, about the needs of what it takes to have a humane society. And he elaborates, he says, conservatives tend to focus more on building up social structures that actually do allow us to flourish in some ways. You do need order. You do need some restrictions. You do need some boundaries. Boundaries, restrictions, herd mentality. Ah! Anybody else starting to hyperventilate? Professor Haidt tends to be kind of harsh on liberals, and he admits that this is because he himself, in his core, is very liberal. And he is concerned because he sees this might have blinded him to some important concepts. He's worried by the contemporary habit of liberals to wrap themselves in self-righteousness and to cut themselves off from ideas that might be key to our social survival. Okay. Side note, Haidt also presents himself as a cisgendered, white, educated male. I'd really like to hear some of his theories examined and tested by people whose identities have experienced more oppression than his. Such people might come to the very same conclusions that he has, or they might have other insights that we would do well to consider. That's my liberal take on things. End of side notes. Okay, so now why are we like this? What's going on in our brains? Some researchers, other researchers, are looking at our brains and the brain activity of people who identify as liberal or conservative. They slide them into MRIs. They find that their brains are functionally and physically, structurally different from one another. Conservative people's brains tend to have larger mass, volume, yeah. Volume, they're not weighing their brains yet. Volume, yet. They have larger right amygdalae. That's part of the brain that's deep and very old, and it's the part that processes emotional information, especially information that is fear-based. While liberal brains tend to have more volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for taking in new information and determining if it's useful. Researchers can predict with about 71% accuracy if a person is liberal or conservative simply based on their brain structure. Dang. These differences in our brain structures might well account for our differences in our cognitive styles, our personalities. It might explain why liberals like variety and diversity and are willing to go try that new restaurant on the other side of town, while conservatives prefer order and predictability and will line up at Calico County right after church. I like Calico County. I go there myself. Okay, but our brains are plastic. Our brains can change and adapt. And what we don't really know yet is if those differences in brain structure are how people are born, or if they develop into those differences over time and experience. We don't know if there is a part of experience that's shaping this significant difference. And which is why we don't really know how people in our own families who could share DNA and experience, and yet they have such wildly different opinions, and why our family gatherings over the holidays can become so difficult. I'm just going to say, when you're really ready to just fling the dinner roll at Uncle Paul or Great Aunt Rachel, just because of the awful political stuff they're spewing all over the dining room table, Hold that roll. Deep breath. There might be an evolutionary reason for Uncle Paul's horrible rhetoric. And why our brains, even though we share this DNA, why our brains are so different. It might be that his conservative brain was better at staying vigilant to possible dangers. That the conservative brains were better at laying out social structures that promoted security, predictability, and order. And it might be that the liberal brains were the ones who went out and investigated those berries to see if they were safe to eat. That went and took up the new technologies or explored new territories that allowed us to expand and thrive as a species. It's quite likely that this brain diversity is vital to our survival. So, if you are feeling exasperated by those other brains, or if you are even smugly assured that your brain is the better kind, hold that roll, stop for a minute, and consider the really big picture. We might need both kinds of brains, the easily frightened and the endlessly curious. We might need both kinds of brains, the ones that value the integrity of the community and the ones that value the dignity of the individual. Both kinds of brains helped us survive in the past, and we might really need both kinds of brains to survive the future. It's going to take both kinds of brains to truly value stability and innovation. Okay. Finally, going back to the work of Jonathan Haidt, he is also fascinated with religion, and he sees that religion throughout human development has been one of the better ways of harnessing all 5 foundational values, and that in doing so, we as a species have achieved astonishing progress. Now, many of us here have also seen how religion, harnessing those 5 values, has done awful things to individuals. I think he's fascinated by it because he identified as an atheist for so long, and so he's curious about religion. I don't think he's quite figured out the power of liberal religion, because what does this mean for us as religious liberals practicing liberal religion? First off, let's remind ourselves we are not an oxymoron. Second off, I believe that we may be vital to the future, that liberal religion is where we might manage to harness all 5 of the foundational values: compassion, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity in life-affirming creative tension. Liberal religion seeks to affirm the dignity of the individual and the integrity of the community, believing that we cannot have one without the other. We're such wackos. I love this about us. And who knows? If we're going to talk evolution here, we might be in the midst of evolving a new brain structure that will just blow apart this insistence on putting everything into tidy boxes with dualistic labels. That'd probably make my theology professor very happy. I think it'd be nice for me too, and for us all. May it be so, and blessed be.